On a cold night in January, a woman worth $4 billion sat alone at a table set for 12 and watched a stranger on the evening news give away the last of the food on his plate. She did not know his name anymore. She had not spoken it out loud in nearly 30 years, but she knew his hands. She would have known those hands anywhere, the way they moved, slow and certain, like a man who had spent his whole life building things and never once been in a hurry. And when the camera moved in close and she saw what those hands were doing, the fork slipped out of her fingers and rang against the china like a bell in an empty church. Because 28 years ago, those very same hands had given away everything they owned. For her. Her name was Margaret Whitfield. She was 52 years old, and she was the chief executive of Whitfield Foods, one of the largest food and grocery suppliers in the country. Her trucks rolled into 30 states. Her name sat on shelves in 10,000 stores. And on that cold January night, she was about to learn that the empire she had built with her own two hands had been started with money that did not belong to her. It had belonged to the man on the screen, the man who was, at that very moment, sleeping on a cot in a church basement 300 miles away. Let me tell you how a woman with everything came to owe everything to a man with nothing, and how, in the end, the two of them found their way back to a small carved bird and to each other. But first, you need to understand who Margaret Whitfield had become, because the woman who dropped that fork was not a soft woman, not anymore. Life, and her father, had seen to that. Margaret Whitfield lived at the top of a glass tower in Chicago, on a floor so high that the city below looked like a circuit board someone had left glowing in the dark. The rooms were beautiful and they were cold, and they were quiet in the particular way that only expensive rooms can be quiet. The silence of a place where nobody laughs, nobody argues, nobody leaves a coat thrown over the back of a chair. The dining table sat 12. In 11 years of living there, Margaret had never once filled it. Most nights, one chair was pulled out. Just the one. She would sit there with a plate of something a chef had left in the warming drawer, and she would eat, and she would work, and the great windows would show her a lake as black and flat as a held breath. She had a corner office and a private plane, and a name that opened doors before she reached them. She had built all of it, brick by brick, deal by deal, over 30 hard years, and she had done it the way her father taught her. Charles Whitfield had been a hard man, a good businessman and a hard man, and in his mind those two things were the same thing. He had started with 3 delivery trucks and a warehouse that flooded every spring, and he had turned it into something real. But he had done it by learning, early, to stop feeling things that got in the way. "A soft heart runs a company into the ground, Maggie," he used to tell her, and he told it to her so many times that by the time she was grown, the words had worn a groove in her, the way a river wears a groove in stone. Charity is a line item, and line items get cut. You remember that, and you'll never go hungry. You forget it, and you'll spend your life feeding everybody but yourself. Margaret remembered it. She built it into everything, into the contracts, into the policies, into the quarterly reviews. Whitfield Foods ran lean and it ran clean, and it never ever let a feeling get in the way of a number. When the giving budget came up each year, the grants the company handed out to food banks and church kitchens and small-town pantries, the last soft thing left over from her father's early days, Margaret's people knew to trim it first. It was a line item, and line items got cut. She told herself she was happy. She told herself that a great deal, late at night, in the enormous quiet. But happiness does not echo, and those rooms echoed all the time. Her father had been gone 8 years now, and here is the strange thing about a hard man's voice. It does not stop when the man does. Charles Whitfield had been in the ground for 8 years, and Margaret still heard him every single day, in the boardroom, in the elevator, in the black glass of the window at night. A soft heart runs a company into the ground. She had believed him her whole life. She was about to find out he had been wrong about the one thing that mattered most. The news was on across the room, because the news was always on. Margaret rarely watched it. It was there the way the table was there, to fill a space that would otherwise remind her how empty the space really was. But something in the story caught her. A winter cold snap had swept down across the Midwest. the kind that turns the breath solid before it leaves your mouth. And a young reporter had been sent out to a church that was running an emergency shelter and a hot meal. Grace Chapel, the banner read. Millbrook, a little town Margaret had never heard of, 300 miles south and a whole world away. The camera moved through a basement hall, folding tables, metal chairs, a long line of people holding trays. And the reporter was saying that places like this one were stretched to the breaking point that winter. More people coming in and less food coming out, because a grant they had counted on for years had quietly disappeared. Margaret half heard it. She was reaching for her wine. Then the camera found a man near the end of a table. He was somewhere in his 50s, silver in his beard, silver at his temples, a face weathered the way a fence post gets weathered, and a stillness about him that made him look, somehow, like the calmest man in a very loud room. There was a little boy beside him, 6, maybe 7, in a coat too thin for the weather. And the boy's tray was empty, and the boy was looking at the man's tray the way hungry children look at food when they have been taught not to ask. And the man broke his bread in half. He didn't make a show of it. He didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. He simply broke the roll in two, and he gave the boy the bigger piece, and then he slid most of what was left on his own tray across the table as well, and he said something that made the boy laugh. You could see it, the small laugh, even without sound. Then the man leaned back in his metal chair with almost nothing left in front of him, and he looked content. That was the word, content. A man with an empty plate, content. Margaret Whitfield went very still, because she had seen a man break bread like that before. Exactly like that. The bigger piece always went to somebody else. Always. It was as natural to him as breathing, and she had loved him for it once, a long time ago, when she was young and poor and certain that the world was kind. The camera moved closer, and on the table beside the man's empty tray was a small object he had been turning over and over in his fingers, the way some men worry a coin or a key. It was made of wood. It was small enough to hide in a fist, and when the light caught it, Margaret saw what it was. It was a bird, a little carved bird, no bigger than a thumb, worn smooth and dark with handling. The fork slipped out of her fingers and struck the plate, and the sound went through those enormous rooms like a stone dropped into a well, because she had one just like it. She had carried it in her pocket for 2 years, and then she had put it in a drawer, and it had been in that drawer for 28 years, and she knew, the way you know your own name, that there had only ever been 2 of them in the whole world. He had carved them both, one for her, one for himself. His name was Daniel Cole, and she had spent nearly 30 years believing that he had left her. Let me take you back, because you cannot understand what Margaret did next unless you understand what she had lost. She was 24 the year she met Daniel Cole, and she was not Margaret Whitfield then, chief executive of anything. She was Maggie, and she was broke, and she was scared, though she would never have admitted the last part to a living soul. Her father's company was drowning. That is the part of the story nobody tells at the investor dinners. Before Whitfield Foods was an empire, it was 3 trucks and a mountain of debt, and there was a year, that year, the year she was 24, when the whole thing came within a week of going under. The bank was circling. The suppliers wanted cash up front. Her father was not sleeping, and the hard man was, for the first and only time in his life, afraid. And in the middle of that terrible year, Maggie Whitfield met a cabinet maker. Daniel Cole had a little shop on the wrong side of the river, a rented storefront with a hand-painted sign, and he made furniture the old way, by hand, by eye, one piece at a time. He was not a rich man, and he was not going to be one, and he knew it, and it did not seem to trouble him at all. He had a way of looking at a rough board and seeing the table hidden inside it. He had a low, unhurried voice, and he had those hands. They met because her father's failing company needed shelving built for a warehouse, cheap and fast, and Daniel had done it, cheap and fast and beautiful, and refused to be paid extra for the beautiful part. Maggie had gone to settle the invoice. She stayed 3 hours. She came back the next week with an invoice that did not need settling, and she stayed longer. He would break his lunch in half and give her the bigger piece. He would walk her home the long way. He carved her a small bird out of a scrap of maple one slow afternoon, and when she asked why a bird, he said, "So you remember you're not stuck here." Birds don't have to stay where they land. And then, because he was honest to a fault, he carved a second one exactly like it and kept it and said, "And this one's so I remember you." She was going to marry that man. She had not told him yet, but she had decided. A girl with no money and a drowning family and a father who frightened even the bank. And for 1 year, she was happier than she had ever been in her life, over a cabinet maker who owned almost nothing and gave away half of that. And then, in the space of a single week, Daniel Cole vanished. Here is what Maggie Whitfield was told, and here is what she believed for 28 years. She was told that Daniel had come to her father, that he had learned how bad the debt was, how close the family was to ruin, and that he had asked her father what it would take to make the trouble go away. And she was told, by her father, in that hard, flat voice that never once wavered, that Daniel had named a price, that he had taken a payment to step aside and disappear, because a man like that, a man with nothing, does not stay around a family that is about to have something, that he had sold his affection for a sum of money and walked out of her life without so much as a note. He was never going to be able to give you a life, Maggie, her father told her. He knew it too. That's why he took the money instead of you. Be grateful. He did you the only kind favor he had in him. And Daniel was gone. That part was true. His shop was closed within the month, the hand-painted sign taken down, the storefront empty. He did not call. He did not write. He simply was not there anymore. And a young woman's pride is a terrible thing, and Maggie Whitfield was too proud to go looking for a man who had, she believed, put a price on her and been paid. So she did the thing her father wanted her to do. She got hard. She threw herself into the company. She poured every ounce of that heartbreak into work, and the work rewarded her, the way it always rewards the wounded. The debt got paid off, sooner than anyone expected, which she never thought to question. The company steadied. Then it grew. Then it grew again. And every year she got a little harder and a little higher and a little further from the girl who had believed the world was kind, until one day she looked up and she was Margaret Whitfield, chief executive, with a table set for 12 and one chair pulled out, and a small carved bird in a drawer she never opened. She had built an empire on the ashes of that year. She had never once asked how the fire went out. That was the story Margaret believed on the night she dropped the fork. It was a lie from beginning to end. And the truth was sitting 300 miles away in a church basement, turning a little wooden bird over and over in a pair of tired hands. Margaret did not sleep that night. She sat at the window with a laptop open and the little carved bird from the drawer sitting on the table beside her, and she did two things she had not done in years. She let herself feel something, and she started to dig. She began where she always began, with numbers, because numbers were the only language she fully trusted. She pulled up Grace Chapel of Millbrook. It took her people about an hour to find it, even at that time of night, because when Margaret Whitfield wanted something found, it got found. Grace Chapel ran a winter shelter and a daily meal. It served a town that had lost a factory and never got it back, and for 11 years, it had received an annual grant from a regional coalition of food programs, a coalition that was funded, in part, by a corporate giving partner. Margaret already knew, in the pit of her stomach, whose name she was going to see. Whitfield Foods. She pulled the file. 3 quarters back, in a routine cost review, her own team had recommended trimming the regional giving budget. It was a line item. Line items got cut. She had approved it herself, in a stack of 40 approvals, in the time it takes to sign your name. She had never seen the town of Millbrook. She had never heard of Grace Chapel. She had cut a number on a page, the way her father taught her, and 300 miles away a church kitchen had gone quietly short of food, and a young reporter had gone out into the cold to tell the country about it, and a man with silver in his beard had broken his bread in half and given away the bigger piece. Her father's system had worked exactly the way he built it to work. Fast, clean, no feelings, and it had reached out across 300 miles and taken the bread out of the hands of the one man on this earth she had ever truly loved. She sat with that for a long time. Then she opened one more file, the oldest records the company had, digitized years ago and never looked at, the ledgers from the year the debt got paid. the year she turned 24. She had never once had a reason to open them. She had one now. It took her until nearly dawn, but she found it. A single payment, large enough in that terrible year to have turned everything around. It was recorded plainly, the way honest bookkeeping records things, with a name in the column beside it. And the name was not a bank. It was not an investor. It was not her father raising money in some clever way. The name was Daniel Cole. Margaret Whitfield read it 3 times, and the truth came apart in front of her, piece by piece, the way a lie always does once you finally hold it up to the light. Daniel had not taken a payment to leave her. Daniel had made the payment. He had sold his shop, the little storefront with the hand-painted sign, the workbench, the tools he had gathered one at a time over years, the only thing in the world he owned, and he had quietly poured every dollar of it into a drowning company that belonged to a man who despised him. He had saved the Whitfields. He had saved her wreck. And then he had disappeared and let her believe the worst of him and never said a word. Her father had taken a man's whole life and dressed it up as a betrayal because he could not stand the idea of his daughter tied to a carpenter, and because a lie was cheaper than gratitude. Margaret sat in the cold blue light before sunrise with a wooden bird in her palm, and for the first time in 28 years, she understood what she had thrown away. Not a man who had put a price on her, a man who had paid the highest price he had, and asked for nothing, and let her hate him so that she would be free. She called down for the car before the sun was fully up. Millbrook was 300 miles of flat gray highway, and Margaret drove most of it looking out the window at a country she had spent 30 years flying over. She had told the driver to let her out 2 blocks short of the church. She wanted to walk. She wanted to feel the distance between the world she lived in and the world she was about to enter, because some distances need to be felt in the feet before they can be understood in the heart. The town told its own story as she walked. A shuttered storefront with the ghost of a name still on the glass, a diner with half its lights on, a hardware store hanging on, and people, regular people, in worn coats, in the kind of cold that gets into your bones, going about the ordinary heroism of an ordinary hard week. Margaret walked through it in a coat that cost more than some of these folks made in 2 months, and she had never in her life felt so much like a stranger to her own country. Grace Chapel was a plain brick church with a plain wooden sign, and around the side, down a short flight of concrete steps, was the door to the basement hall. It smelled of coffee and steam and clean bleach and too many people in too small a room. And under all of it, faintly, something warm and good. The smell of a soup that had been made with care because it had to stretch. A woman met her at the bottom of the steps. She was somewhere past 60, small and square and quick-eyed, with an apron and flour on her hands, and the unmistakable air of a person who has run a kitchen through hard times and is not easily impressed by anybody. "We don't open the meal for another hour," the woman said, not unkind, just careful. "But if you're cold, there's coffee." "My name is Margaret," Margaret said. She left off the last name. She was learning, already, that the last name was a wall, and she did not want a wall. "I'd like to help, however I can. Today, if you'll let me." The woman looked her over, the coat, the shoes, the soft hands that had never scrubbed a pot in their life, and something in her face said she had met 100 well-meaning strangers who showed up once, felt good about themselves, and were never seen again. But she was short-handed, and pride is a luxury a full kitchen can afford, and an empty one cannot. "I'm Ruth," she said. "You can start by learning where the trays go. And take that coat off, honey. You'll cook." Margaret Whitfield spent the next 4 hours doing work she had not done since she was a girl. She carried trays, she wiped tables. She learned, under Ruth's short, unsparing instruction, how to ladle soup so it went far, and how to slice bread so nothing was wasted. She burned her hand on a pan, and Ruth showed her the cold water without a word of sympathy, which was, Margaret realized, its own kind of respect. And slowly, as the hour turned and the doors opened and the room filled, she stopped being a woman worth $4 billion and started being, simply, a pair of hands that were needed. The people came in from the cold, old men and young mothers and children and folks somewhere in between, A whole town's worth of people who had hit the kind of hard stretch that any of us can hit, that most of us are only a paycheck or an illness or a run of bad luck away from. They were polite. They were tired. They said thank you more than people who have plenty ever do. And Margaret, ladling soup, found that she could not look at any of them without seeing a number turn back into a face. And then, near the end of the line, she saw him, Daniel Cole, in the flesh. Older, grayer, thinner than the boy she had loved, but unmistakably, undeniably him. He came through the line quietly, the way a man moves when he has learned to take up as little room as the world will let him. He thanked Ruth by name, and when he reached the end of the line, he did not sit alone. He carried his tray over to a table where a young mother sat with the same thin-coated little boy from the news, and he set himself down across from them like a man coming home. Margaret's hands went still on the ladle. Ruth followed her gaze. "That's Daniel," she said, and her voice softened in a way it had not softened for anybody else. "Been coming through most of the winter. Keeps to himself, mostly. But you watch. He'll give half of whatever's on that tray to the Bennett boy before he takes a bite for himself. Does it every single day. Told me once he'd rather be a little hungry than watch a child be." She shook her head. "There's men in this world that lose everything and turn mean with it, and there's men that lose everything and turn kind. I don't know how the Lord decides, but that one turned kind." Margaret could not speak. She stood there with a ladle in her hand and 28 years rising up in her throat, and she watched the man she had wronged break his bread in half and give the bigger piece to a child, exactly the way he had once broken his lunch in half for a poor girl by the river. She did not go to him. Not yet. She was not ready, and more importantly, she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that he was not ready either. So she did the hardest thing a woman like Margaret Whitfield can do. She waited, and she watched, and she started, very quietly, to make things right. That night, from a plain motel room off the highway, Margaret Whitfield made 2 telephone calls. The first was to her chief operating officer, a careful man named Harold Byrne, who had worked at her side for 15 years and had never once heard her voice sound the way it sounded now. "The regional giving grant we cut last winter," she said. "The Food Coalition. I want it restored. All of it. Back to the first dollar, effective immediately, and I want it doubled going forward." There was a pause on the line. "Margaret, that budget was closed. If we reopen it, the board is going to want to know." "Then the board can ask me," she said, "and I'll tell them the truth, that we cut a number on a page, and it took the bread out of people's hands 300 miles away, and I saw it with my own eyes, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't. Restore it, Harold, tonight." Another pause. Then, quietly, "It's good to hear you, Margaret. The real you. It's been a while." The second call was to a woman she had not spoken to in years, a lawyer, discreet and expensive. And to her Margaret said something stranger still. She wanted a shop found, a commercial space, in the town of Millbrook, suitable for woodworking. She wanted it bought outright, quietly, with no name attached to it that anybody could trace back to her. And she wanted it stocked, a good workbench, and the best hand tools that money could buy, chisels and planes and saws, the kind a real craftsman would recognize and respect. "And the deed," Margaret said. "When it's ready, I want the deed made out to Daniel Cole." "And the message to Mr. Cole?" the lawyer asked. "How would you like it delivered?" Margaret looked at the little wooden bird sitting on the nightstand in the yellow motel light. She had carried it 300 miles in her coat pocket. "No message," she said. "Not yet. He can't know it's from me. Not yet." She closed her hand around the bird. "First he has to see that I've changed, and a man won't believe you've changed because you tell him. He'll only believe it because he catches you being different when you think he isn't looking." She stayed in Millbrook. She, who had never taken more than 3 days away from the company in 30 years, called Harold and told him she would be running things from the road for a while, and she moved into the motel off the highway, and every single day, she went to Grace Chapel and she worked. She carried trays, she wiped tables, she learned the names of the people in the line, and she learned that names are the beginning of everything, that you cannot cut a number on a page once you know the name that goes with it. She learned that the young mother's name was Carla and that the thin-coated little boy was Eli, and that Carla had lost a job when the plant cut its second shift, and was climbing back one small handhold at a time. She learned that a quiet older man named Walt had served his country and come home to a country that did not quite have room for him, and that Daniel Cole always saved him the chair by the radiator because Walt's knee ached in the cold. And she watched Daniel, from across the room, from behind the serving line, in the small, careful way a person watches something they are terrified to lose again. She saw that Ruth had been right, that he had lost everything, and turned kind. She saw that the little wooden bird never left his hand for long. And she saw that he was, underneath the stillness, a man carrying a great weight with quiet grace, the way she imagined he had carried it for 28 years. It was the boy, Eli, who brought them together at last. Children have a way of doing that. Children have not yet learned the walls that grown people build. Margaret was refilling the bread basket at Daniel's table when Eli looked up at her, in that fearless way small children have, and said, "You're new. Daniel gives me his bread. Do you want to sit with us?" And there was no way not to. There was no ladle to hide behind, no tray to carry away. There was only a small boy's invitation and a chair being pushed out with his foot, and Margaret Whitfield sitting down across the table from Daniel Cole for the first time in 28 years. He looked up at her, and she watched his face change. He knew her. Of course he knew her. A man does not forget the face he gave up his whole life for. She saw the recognition go through him like a current, saw the color leave and then come back, saw his hand close very slowly around the little wooden bird until his knuckles went pale, and she saw him decide, in the space of a breath, to say nothing, to hold it in, because the last thing on earth Daniel Cole wanted was for Maggie Whitfield to see him like this, with an empty plate, in a borrowed coat, in a church basement, with nothing left to give away but half a roll of bread. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was steady, and it was a knife to her heart, because, "Ma'am, is what you call a stranger. Thank you for the bread." "You're welcome," Margaret managed. And that was all. That was the whole of it. He would not claim her. He would not shame her by making her recognize him. He turned back to the boy and said something gentle, and Margaret got up on legs that did not feel like her own, and carried the breadbasket away, and in the little bathroom off the kitchen, she gripped the sink and cried the way she had not cried since she was 24 years old. Because he had chosen, even now, even here, to protect her, from the truth of what he had become, from the weight of what she owed him, he was still, after everything, giving away the bigger piece. The shop was ready in 3 weeks. The lawyer had done her work well. It was a good clean space with big windows and a workbench that would make a craftsman's hands ache to touch it, and the tools were the finest that could be had, and the deed sat in a drawer with Daniel Cole's name on it, and not one thread of it could be traced back to Margaret Whitfield. But Margaret had learned, by then, that she could not simply hand it to him. She had spent 30 years handing people things, checks, contracts, terms, cut line items, and she understood at last that a gift with a string on it is not a gift, it is a leash, and that Daniel Cole would rather stay hungry than be led. So she did something else. She went to Ruth. She told Ruth everything. Not the $4 billion, that came later, but everything that mattered. The girl by the river, the little wooden birds, the debt, and the shop he had sold, and the lie her father had built, and the 28 years she had spent hating a man for the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her. She told it all in Ruth's flour-dusted kitchen, and when she was done, Ruth was quiet for a long moment, looking at her with those quick, unimpressed eyes that had, somewhere in the telling, gone soft. "So," Ruth said at last, "you're the girl." "I'm the girl," Margaret said. Ruth nodded slowly. "He's mentioned you, not by name, just once, late, when the hall was empty and it was just the two of us cleaning up. He said there was somebody a long time ago, said she was better off never knowing what it cost, said he'd do it all again." Ruth wiped her hands on her apron. "That man has been giving pieces of himself away his whole life, honey, and nobody has ever once given him a whole thing back." "That's what I want to do," Margaret said. "I want to give him something back, but it can't come from me, not yet. He won't take it from me. His pride. His pride is all he's got left, Ruth said. You take that too, and you've got nothing. She thought about it. Then a slow, shrewd look came into her face, the look of a woman who has spent 40 years finding ways to feed a town that had no money to feed itself. But maybe, she said, it doesn't have to come from you. Maybe it comes from the church. Maybe an old building came available and the congregation wants it put to use, and we happen to have a man who can build furniture, and wouldn't it be a shame to let a gift like that go to waste? Maybe the town needs a carpenter. She smiled for the first time. People will take from a town what they'd never take from a person. Pride's funny that way. And that is how it was done. They told Daniel that Grace Chapel had come into a small building and a modest fund, and that the congregation wanted to start a little enterprise. Furniture, repairs, honest work, to bring some money and some dignity back into a town that had lost too much of both. And they told him that a man who could build things was exactly what such an enterprise needed, and that there was a workbench sitting empty, and a set of tools sitting idle, and would he be willing? Margaret watched from across the hall as Ruth put it to him. She watched him listen. She watched him look toward the little building through the basement window, and she watched something come into his face that she had not seen in 28 years. A spark, quickly guarded, the look of a man who has taught himself so completely not to hope for things, that hope has become almost painful. I can't pay for tools like that, he said. Nobody's asking you to, Ruth said. The tools are the shop's. The work is yours. And the town gets its furniture. That's the whole deal. There's no catch, Daniel. Lord knows this place has done enough taking. Let it do a little giving for once. He was quiet for a long, long time, and then Daniel Cole, who had given away the bigger piece of everything his whole life, said the hardest words a proud man can say. All right, he said, I'll take it. And Margaret, from across the hall, had to turn away so no one would see her face. He was magnificent at it. Of course he was. Some gifts do not leave a person, no matter what the world takes from them, and Daniel Cole's gift had never left him. Within a week, the little shop had the smell of cut wood and linseed oil. Within a month, there were chairs and a cradle and a long, plain table, and word had gone around Millbrook that the carpenter at Grace Chapel did honest work at an honest price, and folks came and paid what they could, and some of what they paid went right back into the meal program, and the whole thing turned, slowly, like a wheel that had been stuck for years and was finally rolling again. Daniel stood up straighter. He put on a little weight. He got a room over the hardware store and a key of his own, and Margaret heard, from Ruth, that the first thing he did in that room was hang up a shelf he had built himself and set the little wooden bird on it, where he could see it. And through all of it, Margaret stayed. She kept working the meal, she kept learning names, and bit by bit, over soup and bread, and the small ordinary talk of people who work side by side, she and Daniel became, cautiously, something like friends, two people carefully not mentioning a river, and a shop, and a girl, and 28 years. He had not said her name, and she had not told him what she'd done, and the two silences sat between them like a pane of glass. You could see clear through it, but you could not reach across, until the day the glass broke. It broke because of the shop's deed. There had been a leak, a small thing, an oversight, in the lawyer's careful work. A single document had been filed at the county, with the name of the trust that had purchased the building. And Daniel Cole, being a careful man, and a man who had learned the hard way to read the fine print of everything, had gone to the county to make sure his rights to the shop were sound, and he had pulled the record, and the name of the trust meant nothing to most people in Millbrook. But it meant something to Daniel, because it was a name he had seen before, long ago, on the day he sold everything he owned. It was one of the old Whitfield holding companies, and once he saw that, a careful man does not stop pulling threads. He came to the church that evening after the meal was over, after the hall was empty and the last tray was washed, and Margaret was drying her hands, and Ruth had gone home. He came in quietly and he stood across the empty hall, and in his hand was a folded county document, and on his face was a look Margaret had never seen on him. Not anger exactly. Something worse. Something like a man watching a wall he had built for 28 years come down. It's you, he said. The shop, the deed, the tools, all of it. It's you. Margaret set down the towel. There was no ladle to hide behind now, no tray to carry away. There was only the truth, and it was finally time. "Yes," she said, "it's me." He looked at her for a long moment, and the folded paper trembled a little in his hand. "You came here to feel better about yourself," he said quietly. And oh, it was quiet. And the quiet was so much worse than shouting. "You saw me on the television, and you felt bad, and you came to play the hero. Buy the poor man a shop, buy him some tools, go home and sleep at night, knowing you did a good thing for a man you—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "For a man you left." "That's not," Margaret started. "You left," he said, and his voice cracked on the word, one crack in all that stillness, and it was the most terrible sound she had ever heard. "You believed I sold you. You believed I took your father's money and walked out. 28 years, Maggie. You believed I put a price on you, and you never once came to ask me if it was true." And there it was. There was the wound, laid open at last. Not the shop, not the money. The wound was that she had believed the worst of him, and had never come to find out. Margaret did not defend herself. She had spent 30 years defending herself, in boardrooms and courtrooms and every hard place her father's world had to offer, and she had gotten very, very good at it. And she understood, standing in that empty church basement, that the one thing she could not do now was be good at it. So she told him the truth instead. "You're right," she said. "I left. I believed him. I was young, and I was proud, and I was hurt, and my father handed me a lie that let me hate you instead of missing you. And I took it, because hating you was easier than the truth." Her voice was shaking now, and she let it shake. "And I built a whole life on that lie, Daniel. An entire life. And I never once asked how the fire went out that year. I never asked who paid the debt. I never looked. I didn't want to look, because as long as I didn't look, I got to be the one who was wronged." She took a breath. "And then 3 weeks ago I finally looked, and I found your name in a ledger from 28 years ago. Next to the number that saved my family, and I understood what you did, and what it cost you, and what I threw away." The paper had gone still in his hand. "I didn't come here to feel better about myself," Margaret said. "I came here because I have felt nothing but worse about myself since the night I saw you break your bread in half on the evening news. I came because you sold everything you had, to save a girl who repaid you by believing you were a liar, and I cannot give you back 28 years. I know that. But I could give you back a workbench, so I did. And I did it quietly, because I knew that if you found out it was me, you'd hand it right back, because that's who you are. You'd rather be hungry than be helped." Her voice broke fully now. "You gave me the bigger piece your whole life, Daniel. Just once. Just once. I wanted to give it to you, and do it right, where you couldn't stop me." The empty hall was very quiet. Daniel Cole looked down at the folded paper in his hand. And then he looked at the little wooden bird, which he had taken out of his pocket without seeming to know he'd done it, and was turning over and over in his fingers, the way he always had, the way he had for 28 years. "You kept yours," he said. It was not a question. He had seen it, that first day, though neither of them had spoken of it, the matching bird she had carried 300 miles. "I kept mine," Margaret said. "I used to think," Daniel said slowly, and his voice had lost its edge now, and what was left underneath was tired and honest and very old, "that the kindest thing I ever did was let you go. Your father sat across a table from me and he said, 'She'll never rise if she's tied to a man like you. You'll be the anchor around her neck her whole life. If you love her, you'll give her the money, and you'll disappear, and you'll let her think whatever she needs to think.' And God help me, Maggie, I believed him. I thought I was setting a bird free." He shook his head, and there was the ghost of a broken smile on it. "I've spent 28 years telling myself it was the kindest thing I ever did. And all this time, you were up in that tower believing I sold you. Some kindness. I set you free, and I let you carry a lie like a stone. I'm not sure which one of us your father hurt worse." "He's gone now," Margaret said, "and his voice has been in my head my whole life, Daniel, telling me a soft heart runs a company into the ground, telling me charity is a line item. I believed that too. I believed all of it, and it took seeing you give a hungry child the bigger piece of your bread to make me understand that the softest heart I ever knew belonged to the only truly rich man I ever met. Daniel Cole set the county document down on the long plain table, and very slowly he crossed the empty hall, and he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see how tired he was, and how kind, and how much of the boy by the river was still, somehow, in there. "I don't know how to forgive 28 years, he said honestly. "I won't pretend to you that I do. That's a lot of years, Maggie. That's most of a life." "I'm not asking you to forgive them tonight," Margaret said. "I'm not asking you to forgive them at all. I'm asking." Her voice failed her, and she made it work anyway, because some things have to be said out loud or they never get said. "I'm asking if you'd let me stay. Not up in the tower. Here, in the town, working the meal, learning the names, being a person again instead of a number. I've had $4 billion and a table set for 12, Daniel, and I have never once been as rich as you were in that church basement with an empty plate. I don't want the tower. I want the table. Even if it's just soup. Even if it's just for a little while. Even if you never forgive me at all." She reached into her coat pocket, and she took out the little wooden bird, worn smooth from 28 years of a drawer she could never quite bring herself to open, and she held it out to him on her open palm. "Birds don't have to stay where they land," she said. "You told me that. I landed in the wrong place a long time ago. I'd like to try landing somewhere better." Daniel Cole looked at the little bird in her hand, and he took his own out of his pocket, and he set it down beside hers, the two of them together for the first time in 28 years, a matched pair at last, on an open palm in an empty church. "All right," he said, and this time when he said it, it did not sound like a proud man surrendering. It sounded like a tired man coming home. "I'll take it." Margaret Whitfield went back to the tower, in the end, but not to live. She went back to run a company that gives very differently now than it did the winter. She cut a line item and never saw the face. The old grant to the Food Coalition was restored, and doubled, and then doubled again. And there is a rule in the giving budget at Whitfield Foods now, written in plain words at the top of the page, that says, "Before any grant to a community program may be cut, someone from this company will go, in person, and stand in the room and learn the names." Because Margaret had learned, at last, the thing her father never did, that a soft heart does not run a company into the ground. A soft heart, it turns out, is the only thing that ever built anything worth keeping. She kept the little room off the highway for a while, and then she kept a small house in Millbrook, plain and warm, with a table that seats 6 and is usually full. There is a workshop across town that smells of cut wood and linseed oil, and a carpenter in it whose furniture is known 3 counties over now, and who still saves the chair by the radiator for an old soldier named Walt, and still breaks his bread in half for a boy named Eli, though Eli is taller now, and his mother Carla has steady work, and the thin coat is long gone. And on a shelf in that plain, warm house, where the evening light can reach them, sit 2 small carved birds, side by side, a matched pair at last. Nobody set a table for 12. Nobody needed to. Because the great cold quiet that used to echo in the tower had finally, after all those years, been filled, not with money, and not with marble, and not with a view of a black and endless lake, just with a person, and a name, and the oldest, simplest, most valuable thing there is, somebody to break the bread in half for.